I'm with Steve Steiger, and it's wintertime in Palo Alto, which naturally leads us to talk about floods. So, Steve, give us a historical concept here. Tell us about, flooding in Palo Alto, starting from about the time that the town was settled.
Well, the creeks in this area have always had a series of floods because the hills to the west of us catch a lot of rain, and they come down, the banks can't hold it, and the surrounding land would flood. This was never really a problem in the early days, especially as Palo Alto was settled in 1890, because downtown Palo Alto is on slightly higher ground. The real problem came after World War II as the town began to grow to the east and the south. The areas out in Greer Road and out beyond Oregon were on much lower ground relative to downtown Palo Alto and were susceptible to floods.
Well, so early days, the only flooding would have been a field which maybe needed the irrigation. But now, let's say 1950, 1955, aren't there some historical markers around that period?
Yeah, well, there were a series of floods after World War II. The first one notable was in 52, but the really big flood was in December of 1955. The ground had already been saturated by some earlier storms, and a huge tropical rainstorm came through this area and dumped inches of water very quickly in the surrounding hills as well as throughout most of California.
So when those Pineapple Expresses come through, I know it's warm, there's generally a lot more water. So what in particular happened in the flood of 55?
Well, what happened is the ground was already saturated in the hills to the west of us, and all the water flew into the creeks. The creeks couldn't hold it, and eventually the banks gave way, and it overflowed into the surrounding lowland areas, including much of Menlo Park and Palo Alto.
Well, now, compare that, say, to the flood of 98, when we had, instead of the Pineapple Express, we had an El Nino. How would you compare the two?
Well, very similar in the sense of where the water went, although I think in 55 it was much more extensive because there was a lot more water. Part of the problem also occurs is when these storms come and then you have a high tide action that causes the water to be blocked up so it can't escape into the bay, that you have these problems. I also want to point out in 1955 this wasn't a problem just to the Palo Alto area. Much of California was flooded. Yuba City, Marysville had much more greater damage in the millions of dollars by the same storm.
Yeah, and that reminds me also of the El Ninos, because there were the Sacramento River flooded and a lot of other areas, as I recall.
Well, the Sacramento Valley used to flood almost annually. Sacramento back in the 1850s was underwater seasonally. But, of course, as late as the 1930s, the Central Valley Project began developing and damming the Lake Shasta, and these other dams were also flood relief as well as water supply, and they held back a lot of the water that would have come down into the Sacramento River and its tributaries. But occasionally, in 1955 is an example of when they couldn't even hold it all back.
Gosh, I just find this also fascinating. I'm sure residents would love more information. How would they do that?
Well, they certainly come by the history desk over here at the Palo Alto Main Library, where I'm here on Tuesday evenings and Thursday afternoons to help you learn more about the flooding in Palo Alto or any other Palo Alto questions.
Thanks so much, Steve.
You're welcome.